Hello and welcome to this video on Buddhism. This video is chapter 3 of my class, What's the Difference? Comparing Christianity to other world religions. And this video exists because I was recording the class, audio recording the class, as we took each class. However, it turned out that last Sunday when I taught this information in my church, I forgot to, well actually I had the tape recorder running, the audio recorder, but it had an SD card that was full, so only a few minutes of it was recorded. So since I had the opportunity to re-record this information anyway, and since there was enough interest in having the audio for it produced, and since I have all this lovely video equipment set up, I just decided to come in here, shoot the video, extract the audio from that, and that will provide the audio for this chapter. That's why I came into this beautiful dark room and decided to talk to you today. So this video will give us chapter 3 on Buddhism. Hinduism and Buddhism both originate from India, and they both have some concepts in common. Unlike Hinduism, however, Buddhism has a founder. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, later called the Buddha, and I will refer to him as the Buddha from this point onward. He was born about 400 to 500 years before Christ, and I realize that there's quite a range there of 100 years, but there's some dispute historically about when exactly the Buddha lived, and so this is, taking in the best suggestions, somewhere 400 to 500 years before Christ. And the Buddha was born in an area now known as Nepal, but at the time it was part of India. He was born to Hindu parents and therefore was familiar with Hindu ideas and concepts, and his father was a wealthy leader in India's warrior caste. Now, because of what his father had lived through as a warrior, he really wanted to shield his son from suffering. And so he gave him a palace to live in and gave him a wife and forbade him from ever leaving the palace grounds. But one day when he was 29 years old, the rebellious side of Siddhartha got the best of him, and he decided to leave the palace. And as he did, he encountered 4 people who represented 4 different kinds of suffering. The first person that he encountered was an old man who, of course, was suffering from the effects of old age. The second person he encountered was a sick man who was, of course, suffering from illness. The third person he encountered was a dead man who, of course, was suffering from death. And the fourth he encountered was an ascetic, someone who had deliberately chosen to be poor in order to find some sort of spirituality. And so this man, although it was by his own choice, was suffering from poverty. Now, after experiencing these 4 sights, Siddhartha left the palace permanently and didn't even say goodbye to his wife and son. And he renounced his position and all of his wealth, and he went on a spiritual quest, seeking the answer to suffering. He was so troubled by the suffering he encountered on his journey outside the palace that he decided he was going to make this a matter of spiritual questing for himself. And so he decided to begin by living a life of poverty. He had lived a life of plenty, had lived in a palace and had everything he needed, had been shielded from suffering up until this event in his life. And so Siddhartha decided to go the other route and live a life of poverty and asceticism. But after living in an ascetic life for quite a while, he did not find the spiritual light to escape suffering that he was seeking. And so at age 35, according to his own testimony, he was meditating under a fig tree by a river and experienced what he called enlightenment, after which he began to be called the Buddha, which means enlightened one, or awakened one, or one who has woken up. And this is where Buddha claims to have discovered the middle way between self-indulgence and asceticism, both of which cause suffering. Now remember, Siddhartha had begun living a life of plenty. He lived in a palace provided by his father. He had a wife and a son. He was shielded from suffering. Then he goes out on this surreptitious journey away from the palace, and he encounters suffering. And so he leaves the palace and decides to live the life of asceticism. So he has lived these polar extremes in his life. He's lived a life of plenty, and he's lived a life of asceticism. And despite having both, he did not find an answer to suffering. Neither plenty nor asceticism gave him an answer to the problem of human suffering. And so while meditating and after experiencing what he calls his enlightenment, the Buddha decides that there is a middle way between these two poles. There's a middle path which he found, in which he claims to have found the answer to suffering. And this middle way involves the extinguishing of desire, which to the Buddha causes human suffering. Now, this middle way is developed along what Buddhists call the Eightfold Path. And as we go a little further into today's discussion, we'll look at what the meaning of the Eightfold Path is. Now, if you're using the class notes that I prepared, you will see in your notes right now a table showing the relationship between Buddhism and Hinduism. And I've given you this table for a couple of reasons. One is that because Buddhism and Hinduism share some things in common, they are frequently grouped together. And in fact, according to some of the research that I've done, there was a time when Buddhism as a separate school of thought almost became indistinct from Hinduism. But most Buddhists today have some very serious differences with Buddhists. Most Buddhists today have some very simple, very significant differences between themselves, Buddhists and Hindus. And so while they do share some characteristics in common, such as a belief in karma and a belief in reincarnation and an origin in India and so forth, even though they have these things in common, they really are distinct in terms of their schools of thought and what they believe about spirituality and so forth. And so the table I've given you here, I will not take time to elaborate on, but if you're looking at the notes, you will see that there are some serious differences between Hinduism and Buddhism. The most important of which is that Hinduism, of course, believes in the existence of God. It's an impersonal God, a force of existence called Brahman. But Buddhism does not believe in God at all, as we will see in a moment. And so although Hinduism and Buddhism have a number of things in common between them, they are distinct. Now, let's come to the Buddhist conception of God. And this is the most significant difference or distinction between Buddhism on one hand and Hinduism on the other. What do Buddhists believe about God? Well, unlike Christianity, which is named after Jesus Christ and who is the object of worship for Christians, Buddhists do not worship Buddha. Of course, Buddhism is named after the Buddha, but Buddhists claim not to worship Buddha. And Buddha himself did not claim to be a divine being. Buddha did not claim to be a divine being. One author said this: in his later years, when India was afire with his message, people came to Buddha asking him what he was. Not who are you, but what are you? Are you a god, they asked? No. An angel? No. A saint? No. Then what are you? Buddha answered, I am awake. His answer became his title, for this is what the Buddha means. And so the point here is that unlike Christians who worship Jesus Christ, and in addition to being the founder, is also the object of worship in Christianity, Buddhism was, of course, founded by the Buddha, but Buddhists claim that they do not worship Buddha. Now, that is the claim that they make in the purest senses of Buddhism. But as you will see if you were to look into Buddhism a little bit further than the information that I'm giving you, you will see that Buddhist ideas are often blended with local deities. And so there are some people who would embrace most, if not all, of the tenets of Buddhism, who would also claim belief in a higher power or a deity of some kind, or maybe many deities. And so Buddhism has a level of syncretism to it, where you might encounter some Buddhists who also believe in other gods. But in terms of the orthodox principles of Buddhism, the ones that Buddhist monks and teachers espouse, Buddhism itself does not believe in the existence of a personal God. One Buddhist has written this: do Buddhists believe in God? No, we do not. And there are several reasons for this. The Buddha, like modern sociologists and psychologists, believe that religious ideas, and especially the God idea, have their origin in fear. The Buddha says, gripped by fear, men go to the sacred mountains, sacred groves, sacred trees, and shrines. The author continues and says, primitive man found himself in a dangerous and hostile world. The fear of wild animals, of not being able to find enough food, of injury or disease, and of natural phenomena like thunder, lightning, and volcanoes was constantly with him. Finding no security, he created the idea of gods in order to give him comfort in good times, courage in times of danger, and consolation when things went wrong. To this day, you will notice, this author says, that people become more religious at times of crises. You will hear them say that belief in a god or gods gives them the strength they need to deal with life. You will hear them explain, this author says, that they believe in a particular god because they prayed in time of need and their prayer was answered. All this seems to support the Buddhist idea, or the Buddhist teaching, that the God idea is a response to fear and frustration. The Buddha, says this man, taught us to try to understand our fears, to lessen our desires, and to calmly and courageously accept the things we cannot change. He replaced fear not with irrational belief, but with rational understanding. And so this author tries to explain that Buddhists and Buddha himself do not teach and did not believe in a personal God or any kind of God concept like Hindus do and like, of course, we Christians do. Now, this does not mean, however, that Buddhism is like the modern philosophy of atheism. Let me take a moment to distinguish the differences between atheism and Buddhism. Western atheists believe that the only reality that exists is material reality, and that therefore people do not have souls or spirits. When a person dies, according to a pure atheist, his existence is extinguished. His body is dead, and that's all that there is to him. Buddhists, however, believe in a spiritual realm. They believe that there are spirit beings and that there is a life after this life. In fact, Buddhists believe in a concept of hell, believe it or not. And so, as one Buddhist put it, Buddhists believe that there are beings that inhabit the various celestial realms. These are variously called angels, spirits, gods, and devas by various cultures. And so while Buddhist beliefs are compatible somewhat with atheism, most Western atheists could not be Buddhists. And that's because while Buddhist teachings are sometimes combined with other belief in gods, Buddhism itself does not teach the existence of God and sees the issue as unimportant or unhelpful. Perhaps it's best to say that Buddhism is not atheistic as much as it does not see belief in God, any God, as essential to Buddhism. One author wrote this: however, Buddhism is not atheistic in that modern secularism, rationalism, humanism, etc. could be regarded as atheistic, though it has much in common with them. Buddhism is not concerned primarily with refuting the notion of God, as some atheistic writers have done. It is principally concerned with developing a method of escape from this world, from worldly ills. This involves undertaking a method of spiritual discipline, of mental discipline, and a code of conduct, which is sufficient to satisfy the most demanding spiritual requirements. Indeed, only very little of the Buddha's voluminous discourses deal directly with the question of God. He was more interested in a way of expounding, a way to personal salvation, and to improve the weal of mankind, both in this world and in the worlds to come. So unlike most religions which have God as ultimate, in Buddhism, God is not ultimate because the question of God is unimportant to the Buddhist. But that does not mean that Buddhism itself does not have some ultimate concept. In fact, in distinguishing most religions which have God as ultimate in their thought, in Buddhism, nirvana is ultimate. Unlike most religions which have God as ultimate, nirvana is ultimate in Buddhism. Nirvana exists as the closest thing to a God concept in Buddhism. As one author has written, is nirvana God? Well, it depends on how the word is defined. That's the word God is defined. If it designates a personal being who created the universe by deliberate design, Nirvana is not God, and Buddhism is atheistic. The word God, though, has a second meaning, however, which theologians sometimes call the Godhead. Buddhaologists have compiled a list of characteristics of Nirvana that place it in the Godhead camp. Nirvana, they would say, is permanent, stable, imperishable, immovable, ageless, deathless, unborn, and unbecome. It is power, bliss, and happiness, the secure refuge, the shelter, the place of unassailable safety. It is the real truth and the supreme reality. It is the good, the supreme goal, and the one and only consummation of our lives, the eternal, hidden, and incomprehensible peace. And so, Buddhism itself, although does not believing in a personal God or even an impersonal God, because nirvana is ultimate in Buddhism, you might say that the God concept, the attributes that most Christians and other theists would ascribe to God, are ascribed to what Buddhists believe in as nirvana. Now, this, of course, distinguishes it from Christianity, because according to Christianity, the goal of life is not to achieve nirvana, but it is to glorify God. 1 Corinthians 10:31 from the Bible says, "So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all for the glory of God." And this is just one of many passages in the Bible that say that the ultimate purpose of worship, of the Christian life, of belief in God and His Son Jesus Christ, is to glorify God. And in fact, one formulation of Christian doctrine, the Westminster Confession in question 1 says this: "What is the chief end of man?" And the answer is, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. But Buddhism, by contrast, has as its goal to enter nirvana, which is not worshipped as we worship God personally, but being the ultimate goal, it stands in the place of God in Buddhist thought. Now let's compare Buddhist beliefs about God to Christian teaching about God. In Christianity, of course, we believe many things about God. We believe that God is Trinity. We believe that God is Creator. We believe that God is holy and just. We believe that God is loving and merciful and gracious and so forth. All of those characteristics, which if you're looking at my notes, are listed on the on the right side of the table there, contrasting Buddhism and Christianity. But when we look at what Buddhism posits about God, of course, it would deny every single one of these things. Buddhist thought, when compared to Christianity, would say that all of these characteristics of God are unimportant and, in fact, incompatible with the fact of suffering. They would say that a God who is loving cannot be true because suffering exists, and so forth. And so Buddhists do not seek to worship a personal being. They seek to extinguish all desire and thus become enlightened, like the Buddha himself. When an enlightened person dies, according to Buddhism, he enters nirvana. And so this is one way in which Christianity's teaching about God is separate from Buddhism. Now, in terms of Buddhism, what is humanity's relationship to God? What does the Buddha say about humanity and its relationship to God? Well, again, since Buddhism itself is explicitly non-theistic, it therefore does not have anything to say about humanity's relationship to God. Now, although there are Buddhist temples, they do not exist for worship or prayer, but rather for meditation and for instruction. Buddhism, formally speaking, has no place in it for prayer or for worship. Meditation, as we'll see, is for attaining enlightenment. It's not about worship or prayer. For Buddhism, the ultimate goal of spirituality is not to connect to the Creator God, but to end one's own suffering. As we've seen, suffering is the key to understanding Buddhism, for, according to the Buddha story, while seeking the answer to suffering, he was meditating under a fig tree and experienced enlightenment. Following his enlightenment, he preached his first sermon, called the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths summarize the Buddha's enlightenment. And so I'm speaking about them here under this heading of Buddhism's relationship to humanity, or God's relationship to humanity, to clue you in on what Buddhism teaches about man's relationship to spirituality and how enlightenment, which is the goal of Buddhism, is found. So here are the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha supposedly became enlightened about while meditating under the fig tree, and these Four Noble Truths were the subject of his first sermon. Number one, the first noble truth, according to the Buddha, is that life is suffering. Number two, the second noble truth, is that suffering comes from desire. When I use the word desire, I'm not speaking about desire in a very specific sense. The word desire is the best word we could come up with to try to take in a bunch of different concepts. For the Buddha, desire equals all kinds of human desires. For instance, the desire for food, the desire for sex, but it has more than just the desires of the body. It has to do with lust. It has to do with attachment, meaning attachment to physical things in this world, attachment to other people, and so forth. For the Buddhist, desire is simply seeking permanence in a temporary world. The Buddhist would say someone who wants something to last permanently or to live forever is seeking permanence in an impermanent world, in a temporary world. And that's going to create desires that can never be satisfied because the world is temporary. And so the second noble truth is that suffering comes from desire, all kinds of desire. The third noble truth, according to Buddhism, is that a person can end suffering by becoming dispassionate, the ultimate form of which is nirvana. And so, as we will see through meditation and through other Buddhist practices, the Buddhist goal is to end desire, to become dispassionate about the world around them, to not crave any kind of desires, and the ultimate expression of this is nirvana. The fourth noble truth is that nirvana is found on the Eightfold Path, and we will discuss the Eightfold Path shortly when we look at the issues of revelation and salvation. For now, understand that Buddhism is completely about human effort. And so let's compare Buddhist beliefs now about humanity's relationship with God to Christianity's teaching about man's relationship to God. Christianity, of course, says that humanity is created by God, was created in God's image, and is accountable to God. But according to Buddhism, this is not true. The Buddhist would say that humanity was not created by God. Now, there's some older Buddhist literature that refers to creation by the gods, but the Buddhists today, contemporary Buddhism, would tend to embrace evolution as an explanation for origins. Instead of saying, like Christianity does, that humanity is accountable to God and will be held accountable for the things that we do in this life, the Buddhists would say that humanity is not accountable to God, but in fact is held accountable by karma. Christianity would say that humanity is separated from God by sin, but Buddhism would deny this and say, no, humanity is separated from nirvana, and that separation from nirvana is the separation comes from desires that cause suffering and bad karma. Christianity would say that humanity is unable to follow God without grace and mercy, but Buddhism has no place for mercy. It has no place for grace. It has no place ultimately or metaphysically speaking for forgiveness. Instead, for the Buddhist, one must know the Four Noble Truths and become enlightened by following the Eightfold Path. Now let's come to the question, has God communicated to humanity, and in what ways? Well, Buddhists, of course, have beliefs about revelation and the sources of revelation, but again, since Buddhism is atheistic, they do not hold that God has revealed himself in any way. One Buddhist writer has written, "The study of the religious term divine revelation is usually used to indicate a supernatural origin of a set of beliefs or sacred texts. It is in this sense that the classic religions, which originated in the Middle East, have been regarded as revealed religions. The founder of these religions are regarded by their followers either as prophets chosen by God to act as a mouthpiece for his communication with humans, as in the sense of Muhammad in Islam, or as God himself in some disguise, as with Christianity and Jesus. The truth of these religions, again according to this author, is attributed to their supposed divine origin. Indeed, the followers of these religions do not apply the claims of their founders the normal criteria that are used to establish the truthfulness of other claims. On the other hand, Buddhists have generally claimed that Buddhism owes its origin to no such divine revelation. The historical Buddha is credited with the discovery of the truth relating to the universe and to the human condition that he proclaimed, just as Einstein might be credited with the discovery of certain truths relating to space, time, and matter. In both cases, the validity of their respective claims depends on the empirical, experimental, and experiential evidence that there is to support them. The Buddha in particular did not appeal to any divine authority to validate what he was saying, and indeed invited people to test his claim for themselves. And that's the end of the quote. Now, there's a bunch in there that we as Christians would disagree with, but to just understand that at this point, the Buddhists would say that their teachings are different than Christianity, whereas Christianity says that the Bible is revealed truth, revealed from the Creator God. Buddhism would say, no, it's not a revealed religion. These are truths that the Buddha discovered, just as scientists, as men, discovered principles of physics or the truth of gravity and so forth. Now, that does not mean, however, that Buddhists have no scriptures, for there are many writings that Buddhists revere and study as containing the teachings of Buddhism. Now, these writings that supposedly contain the truths of Buddhism were not written by the Buddha himself, and in fact, they were written long after Buddha's time on this earth ended. They were written down by his followers long after, based on oral traditions. And so unlike the Bible, which claims to be God's word revealed to humanity, Buddhists do not have an authoritative text. One author says this: is there a Buddhist Bible? Not exactly. Buddhism has a vast number of scriptures, but no one text is accepted as authentic and authoritative by every school of Buddhism. Instead, each school of Buddhism has its own ideas about which scriptures are important. There's one other reason that there is no Buddhist Bible. Many religions consider their scriptures to be the revealed word of God, or gods. In Buddhism, however, it is understood that the scriptures are the teaching of the historical Buddha, a human being, or other enlightened masters. The teachings in Buddhist scriptures are directions for practice, or how to realize enlightenment oneself. What is important is to understand and practice what the texts are teaching, not just to believe in them. And that's the end of that quote. Although Buddhism does not claim to have revealed authoritative scriptures, it still has essential truth claims. The essential truth claims of Buddha are contained in the Eightfold Path. And you may remember earlier that I said that Buddhism and Buddha's enlightenment happened when he discovered the Four Noble Truths. And the fourth of those Four Noble Truths is that enlightenment is found on the Eightfold Path. And so now it's time, when we discuss the issue of revelation and salvation, to talk about the Eightfold Path. Remember that when the Buddha experienced enlightenment, he believed he had found a middle path between suffering and self-indulgence. That middle path is the Eightfold Path. Also recall that in Buddha's sermon, The Four Noble Truths, the fourth noble truth was that nirvana is found on the Eightfold Path. And so let's look at the Eightfold Path. And this Eightfold Path all involves righteousness in a general sense. Number one, the first truth on the Eightfold Path is what Buddha called right view. And this means the right outlook about the world around you. It means believing that the Four Noble Truths are true, and thereby getting the right view or understanding of the world when you understand the Four Noble Truths. To a Buddhist, the right view is that there is a moral law of karma that will produce reactions in your life, and that everything is impermanent, which is what makes desire unfulfillable, and that the world around you is suffering. These are all the essential truths, according to Buddhism, for finding right view. Second on the Eightfold Path is right intention. After understanding the Four Noble Truths to get a right view, the Buddhist then resolves to remove themselves from immorality and to seek moral self-improvement. The right intentions specifically are to renounce desire, to resist anger and other bad intentions toward others, and to become compassionate and nonviolent. And so the second stepping stone, you might say, or the second step on the Eightfold Path has to do with right intentions, the intention to get rid of these things in your life, these desires that cause suffering for yourself and for other people. Third on the Eightfold Path is right speech. Right speech. In this step on the Eightfold Path, the Buddhist chooses not to lie or to be deceitful. He or she then resolves not to speak in ways that harm others, such as slander or gossip, or even to use speech that is shallow and purposeless. I guess the Buddhists have no room in their religion for small talk. One author says this, positively phrased, this means to tell the truth, to speak friendly and warm and gently, and only to talk when necessary. And that's the end of the quote. Fourth on the Eightfold Path is right action. Right action. This means using the body in a morally positive way by not killing or hurting others, by not stealing or defrauding others, and by not engaging in immoral sexual activity, which to the Buddhist is not so much about marriage as much as it is about harming other people through sexual activity. Number 5 on the Eightfold Path is right livelihood. On this step, the Buddhist seeks to earn a living that does not harm others. One author says, quote, the Buddha mentions 4 specific activities that harm other beings and that one should avoid for this reason. Number 1, dealing in weapons. Number 2, dealing in living beings, such as including raising animals for slaughter, as well as slave trade and prostitution. Third, working in meat production and butchery. And fourth, selling intoxicants such as poison and other poisons such as alcohol and drugs. Furthermore, any other occupation that would violate the principles of right speech and right action should be avoided. And so on the 5th step on the Eightfold Path, the Buddhist looks after his living and tries to earn his living in a way that does not violate these other tenets of Buddhism. 6th on the Eightfold Path is right effort. And this is all about willpower. In this step, the Buddhist resolves to try to give mental energy and force of will to the other steps on the Eightfold Path. It's about your desire, your intention, your will to be dedicated and to dedicate yourself to moral improvement. It's to give your effort, not to earn these desires that cause suffering, but rather to follow these phases of improvement. And the above 4 phases of right effort mean to, number 1, prevent the unwholesome that has not yet arisen in your life. So other unwholesome desires that you've not struggled with, you resolve to try to keep them down. Number 2 is to let go of the unwholesome that has already arisen in yourself. The desires that you're aware of need to be extinguished and tamped down. Third is to bring up the wholesome that has not yet arisen in yourself. There are wholesome desires within you, the Buddhists would say, and you need to arouse those, to stir them up and to raise them into your life in a conscious way. And number 4, to maintain the wholesomeness that has already arisen in yourself. Number 7 on the Eightfold Path is right mindfulness. Right mindfulness. This means to think before you speak and to try to stay in that middle path between self-indulgence and self-denial or suffering. This is done by keeping the mind free of covetousness, of malice, of laziness and worry and doubt. And then number 8 on the Eightfold Path is right concentration. Right concentration. This is all about meditation. And through meditation, the Buddhist focuses on one object, his breathing or a word, and seeks to create a state of heightened concentration that elevates the Buddhist concentration in the rest of his everyday life. Now let's compare these beliefs about revelation through the Eightfold Path to Christianity's belief about how God has spoken to humanity. In Buddhism does not agree that agree with or have any analogy to aspects of Christianity, such as that God reveals his existence through creation, or that God reveals his laws through conscience, or that God reveals himself through the Bible, or that God has revealed himself in Christ. Remember when we talked about Christianity, these 4 principles, that God reveals his existence through creation, through conscience, through the Bible, and through Christ, are the tenets of revelation that Christians believe. But the Buddhist has no analogy to these and doesn't agree with any of them. But what's curious is that although the Buddhist denies the existence of a personal God, the Buddha was quite adamant about right and wrong. Notice that the Eightfold Path contains 8 ideas that a person has to do right in order to avoid bad karma or to break free of reincarnation and to find nirvana. Really, each of those right things is actually just a category containing many other attitudes and actions that the Buddha would say are right, and that have to be chosen against those that are wrong. Buddhism, then, is all about human striving. You are on your own for personal self-improvement, struggling against all the bad karma that you've accumulated in this life and, oh, by the way, in multiple lives past. And with no God to reveal himself to you, to love you, to have mercy on you, to show you his grace, Buddhism offers you a path revealed not by God, but by man, who makes no claim to divinity, has no revelation on which to base his truth claims, and no evidence to support the truthfulness of anything he tries to teach you. See, this is the thing about Buddhism, is they would say, well, you should test the Buddha's truth claims. Great. How do you test the idea that nirvana exists outside of this life and that one can attain nirvana if he follows the Eightfold Path? You can't. And so it's impossible to test the truth claims of Buddhism, and therefore they should easily be rejected. Now let's look at Buddhism in America and Buddhist practice in America. The truth is that Buddhism is not widely practiced in the United States, and studies show that less than 1% of Americans identify themselves as Buddhists. However, there are a number of famous Americans who self-identify as Buddhists, such as Tiger Woods, the athlete, the golfer. Actor Richard Gere self-identifies as Buddhist. Oliver Stone, the director, does, and retired basketball coach Phil Jackson are all well-known self-described Buddhists. Furthermore, the Dalai Lama, a Tibetan Buddhist leader, is recognized in the United States and has published a number of books. At one point, he had 2 books on the New York Times bestseller list at the same time, which is a very rare feat for an author. The Dalai Lama has also won the Nobel Peace Prize back in 1989, and he has also received the Congressional Medal of Honor, which he received in 2007. And so here's a Buddhist leader who has had 2 bestsellers on the New York Times bestseller list, who's received the Nobel Peace Prize, who received the Congressional Medal of Honor in the United States. And so even though Buddhism is not practiced by a lot of Americans, that does not mean that Buddhism is empty from American life. In fact, we see that there's quite a bit of Buddhism circulating around American culture. Here are some ideas, Buddhist ideas in American life. Like Hinduism, the New Age movement has adopted many Buddhist ideas. And second, Americans who practice meditation are most likely following the Buddhist ideas of meditation, even though they may not know the Four Noble Truths. I read one Buddhist author in my research for this topic who talked about and really was bemoaning the fact that so many people claim to meditate and claim to follow the tenets of Buddhism without even knowing the Four Noble Truths, one of the cardinal doctrines of Buddhism. But there you have it, meditation and the fact that most people who do meditate claim to be following the practices of Buddhism show that there is some adherence to Buddhism in the United States, at least in some sense. Next, Hollywood has produced some movies that have Buddhist teaching in them. Some overt, such as 7 Years in Tibet, but other more popular movies have storylines that are based on Buddhist ideas, such as Star Wars and The Matrix. Next, when we talk about Buddhist ideas in American life, we should note that although Buddhism is minuscule in America, there is some evidence that it is growing. Now, what's the difference between Buddhism and Christianity? We've talked about some differences already, but let's talk about some of the core ideas that distinguish Christianity from Buddhism. And the truth is that many of the same issues that separate Christianity from Hinduism also apply to Buddhism. Like Hinduism, Buddhists believe in karma and reincarnation based on karma. But since Buddhism believes that the world exists as an uncreated, uncaused thing, and that there is no personal God, no God of justice to observe and pay back evil, then who's really keeping track of your karma anyway? I mean, in Christianity, we believe that there is a personal God, a God who is righteous and just, a God who knows all and who sees all things, and a God who exists as judge over all people and to whom all people will give an account. And so the Christian ideas of sowing and reaping and the Christian idea of justice and righteousness all relate to the fundamental personality of God. And while Buddhism claims that what you do in this life will affect your next life through karma, how is this possible? If there's no personal God to keep track of everyone's karma, then how can karma be visited upon you in the next life through reincarnation? And how can you ever know that you've broken free of it to find nirvana in the next life? More importantly, Christianity holds that actions and thoughts are moral or immoral based on how they conform or fail to conform to the character of God and His revealed will for humanity. In other words, we have a standard for righteousness, and that standard is God Himself, His nature, and who He is. And His laws that He has passed down say, thou shalt not kill, and therefore establish a standard of righteousness. But here's Buddhism. It doesn't believe that any God exists. And so, if no God exists, then how can anything be judged as right, as in the Eightfold Path, where every one of those steps on the Eightfold Path has the word right modifying it? I mean, how can there be anything that's right in a Buddhist world? And how can anything be said to be wrong in Buddhism? If no standard exists for measuring morality, if morality and karma and reincarnation are natural laws like the law of gravity, then where did these laws come from? I mean, Christians believe that even natural laws such as gravity and physics or the law of the farm, sowing and reaping, are expressions of the nature of God, that they exist because God decreed them to exist. And so Christians believe that these natural laws such as gravity, physics, sowing and reaping, and moral laws are established by an all-wise creator God who is holy, righteous, and just. Ideas of right and wrong make sense in Christianity because they all flow from the personality of God. And if there is no God, according to Buddhism, then the natural laws, which everyone sees the truth of, and the moral laws, which Buddhists also hold to, have no rational basis and should not exist. Let's come to the issue of suffering, because one thing that Buddhists and Christians can agree on is the existence of suffering. Going further, we've seen some agreement that suffering stems from desire, especially from immoral desires. In the Bible, in James chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, it says, What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You want something, but you don't get it. You kill and covet, but you cannot have what you want. You quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. This passage acknowledges that sin is the result of desire and that most of the problems in the world stem from immoral desires or immoral actions that come from desire. But the similarities between Christianity and Buddha end right there. Buddhism does not have a good answer for the source of desire. I mean, where do these desires come from? If desires cause suffering, and we've seen that Christianity can agree with that in some senses, where does desire come from, according to the Buddhists? Well, Christianity holds that some desires were created by God and are therefore good. See, in Buddhism, hunger is a bad thing, but Christianity would say, no, hunger is a good thing. It's created by God for the sustenance of life. The desire for sex, according to Buddhism, is bad because it's a desire. And Christianity would say, no, the desire itself for sexual expression is not bad. It was created by God, and in the context of marriage, it is holy and righteous and just. And outside the context of marriage, it becomes sinful. But Buddhism has no categories like that. All desires to the Buddhists are bad because they are going to lead you to suffering. Also, Christianity teaches that sinful desires and righteous desires that are satisfied in sinful ways are the result of human rebellion against God personally and against His Word. We call this sin in Christianity, and it's the result of every human problem, and it's the cause of suffering and the result of every human problem. See, what Buddhism is about, like every other religion, as we've looked at, is about human effort. When it comes to escaping suffering and achieving enlightenment and nirvana, Buddhism has only one answer: human effort. Christianity, however, denies that human effort can end in righteousness in a person's life or obtain any favor with God. In Christianity, what saves you from your sinful desires and the consequences of sin, what the Buddhists would call karma, is God's grace. It's His free gift of salvation, earned not by you, but by Jesus Christ, and given as a gift to all who call upon God for it. But Buddhism has no place for grace. Your moral improvement and your salvation from karma is all up to you. There is no God who can save you. Christianity, however, has no place for human works in salvation. And like Hinduism, Buddhism has no capacity for forgiveness, no capacity for reconciliation. A person can't find relief from bad karma, and there's no metaphysical basis for human forgiveness and reconciliation in Buddhism. In Buddhism, all your unright view, unright thinking, unright speech, and so forth, all those negative things on the Eightfold Path, that just means that there's karma to pay. But in Christianity, Christ offers relief from all of these for those who call upon him. And so there are major differences between Christianity and Buddhism. And Christianity offers a much, much more coherent brand of spirituality because it's reflected in truth. It's reflected in the truth of the one true and living God who has revealed himself perfectly in the person of Jesus Christ. He is the one who has the answer for human suffering, because in him, sin, which is the true cause of suffering, can be eliminated.